update in my triple feature for tonight. This second film was Irving Pichel's Happy Land. It's from 1943, and it was written by Catherine Scola. And this film came out the same year as The Human Comedy, which was by Clarence Brown and starred Mickey Rooney. Both films are about dealing with the death of young men during World War II and how we as a country need to accept that men can die in war. That's basically what these films, there's various different aspects of sort of war propaganda films that were made during the war, and some were set, in the troops, and some were like anti-Nazi and all kinds of things. And then there were these war-at-home films like The Human Comedy and Happy Land, where Hollywood set out to try to ease the minds of the parents of the young men who went off and died, right? So in The Human Comedy, it's Mickey Rooney sort of learning about everyone in his town. In Happy Land, it is Don Ameche, who he was a pharmacist in a very small town, and he's like, everyone trusts him. He's been a pharmacist. His father was a pharmacist. His grandfather was a pharmacist. Like, they are the pillars of this community. And he discovers that his only son, Rusty, has been killed. So the rest of the film is sort of this weird It's a Wonderful Life-esque flashback with his grandfather, who clearly is dead, who has come back to like show him that like Rusty lived and had a good life, even though he died at 22. And what's interesting about the film in so much that it shows all these nostalgia points and all these like moments of growing up that this kid has seen and how he lived this great life. But you get to the end of the film, spoilers, and Don Ameche, the father, he's not convinced. He's not convinced that just because he hit these milestones that his son lived enough life to be worth dying in this war. And then he meets a man that his son saved in the war. And that's what convinces him. Like, his son saved someone else's life, and if his son hadn't gone and put his life in the line, he couldn't have saved this other guy. And so it's that sort of pay it forward thing. I don't know that I buy that, but I see how that could maybe be a very comforting thought for grieving parents during the war. Also interesting, not related, but there's this great documentary called Teenage that came out a few years ago, and I actually own the book that it was based on. I have not read it yet because it's like 800 pages, but it traces the rise of the idea of the teenager. And the reason I bring this up is that in 1943, you didn't really have the teenager yet. So when Rusty goes off to war, he's lived his life. He was at that age where he could go out and get married, and like what we think of now as our 20s and in the post-teen years is really what teenagers lived before the idea of teenager really coalesced. Like, it started in the mid-turn of the century, but it didn't really become what we think of as teenage years until post-war and really in the 50s. So the Rusty that we see now, we see Rusty as a kid. We see him as someone who really hasn't lived, who's barely past being a teenager. But in 1943, that concept wasn't the same, and he really had lived more of a life. Like, Rusty at 22 in 1943 is what we would think of as like 35 now, almost practically. So it's interesting to think about the way the concept of age changes as society changes. So check out the film Teenage. It's really a fascinating documentary. This was Irving Pichel's Happy Land. It's an interesting one. I believe it's on DVD from 20th Century Fox's like manufactured on demand collection. I'm not really sure. But I watched it on TCM. I think it's probably going to be a watch TCM later tonight. Along with Don Ameche, there's Francis D., Harry Carey, Anne Rutherford, Cara Williams, and Harry Morgan. So it's an interesting film. Definitely would be not fun, but like make a fascinating double feature with The Human Comedy, I think, the 1943 War at Home double feature. And like I said, check out Teenage. It'll make you think about the concept of being a teenager very differently, and let you think about society in a really interesting way. So this was 1943's Happy Land, directed by Irving Pichel, starring Don Ameche. Check it out if you can find it.